All right, thank you very much, Sophie. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome. I'm glad to be here and to share some of my thoughts about something which has been bugging me for a long time. Of course, if you go from one religion to the other, you look back on your own religion, and before you do the step, you think a lot about the new religion. So it all comes together. And we're here now to speak about the identity and why I think it is a myth. Something Sophie has not said. I've been in German politics for a long time, and I've always tried to bring people to a consensus. So, I mean, confrontation is not my thing. And apart from going to grammar school in the UK, I've spent a lot of my life in the US. So everything you have here now is German, English, American, in the framework of Islam. So that is my background. And why do I ask myself these questions, and why am I talking about them today? It's all for me about the question of inclusion. This land is your land. This land is my land. This is a line from one of US America's most meaningful and most beautiful folk songs. In my country, Germany, we do not have such a song. Politicians and journalists debate instead if, for example, Muslims are part of Germany, or if Islam belongs to Germany, or to German culture. This controversy reminds me of the times when the principle cuius regio, eius religio was valid. At that time, rulers could decide what religion their subject should have and, with other words, who belonged and who did not. Today, thank God, things are different. Politicians in their speeches and papers no longer can determine who belongs and who does not. In Germany, and I assume in the UK too, we have clear laws which state who is a citizen, who is not, who may come, who may stay and become a citizen, and who has to go. In other words, who belongs and who does not, period. However, this does not solve the problem of inclusion and exclusion. In the mental framework of, I'm afraid, many people, there still exists two theoretical, intellectual, spiritual principles which they use as a foundation for inclusion. Human rights on one side and the myth of Christian Europe on the other side. When discussing with Muslims, Westerners claim that they are the ones who have gone through Renaissance and Enlightenment and that they discovered the human rights, which are now a universal value. These statements usually are followed immediately by a big but. That, of course, Europe is defined by Christian values, Christian history, and Christian culture. And here we touch the question of inclusion and exclusion of the other to European society. The question, if it is a simple statement of facts, or is it a statement that leads to exclusion? You are not of this culture, and unless you submit to its principle, you are not part of us. Unfortunately, the statement is mostly used to justify exclusion, or at least to demand submission to it before inclusion is granted. One could argue back and forth of the validity and justification to use this as a principle of exclusion. However, this debate will not lead anywhere if we do not find out what is Christian and if Europe ever was and maybe still be Christian, or if it was Christian but no longer is. I shall try to find answers to these questions with this paper. First, I shall try to define what is Christian, and for that matter, what is Jewish and Muslim. Then I shall briefly deal with the fact that it is people, not religions or cultures, that act and fight and write history books about it. Then I shall take you on a walk through European history, and finally I shall put forward my answer to this question, and I shall make just one recommendation for the future. The meaning of Christian. I shall use the adjective Christian in this context as a religious category. There is the Christian message, Christ being the Son of God, crucified, resurrected, opening the possibility for the redemption of human beings who are sinners. There are the commandments, thou shalt not kill, and some basic principle: give to God what belongs to God, and to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Do not fight or retaliate, see Sermon of the Mount. Do not pursue material goods, and practice solidarity with the poor. An act shall be called Christian if it relates to the message or follows a commandment. So belief and action, theory and practice, if you will, have to go together in order to apply the adjective Christian, and I shall test this for certain developments of European history and check what can be called Christian in today's Europe. It is not enough that European culture was built by Christians to call European a Christian continent. But first of all, I say a little thing in between, because usually we speak about cultures that fight each other and Christianity expanded and so on. I think this is wrong. It is people who make history. If we read history books about European culture, we almost immediately stumble over terms like Jewish Christian heritage, Jewish Christian Greco-Roman culture. We find sentences like Christendom expanded, Christendom determined European culture. Authors of the late 20th century tell us that the war of civilizations is threatening us. This is putting it the wrong way, in my opinion. Christendom did not and does not expand. Cultures do not fight each other, and wars do not break out. German playwright Rolf Hochhuth says it clearly. The war did not break out. It was started by people as vehemently as it was intended. Or in the words of Samuel Britton, Germany did not invade Belgium in 1914 or Poland in 1939. German troops did, and the sufferings were of individuals. Therefore, and this is the basis of everything I have to say tonight, we must put into and keep it in our minds. It is always human beings who act, and it is human beings who benefit or suffer from the action of others. Christendom expanded because people who were convinced of the Christian teaching convinced or forced others to believe in Christian teaching. We may base our dealings on concepts, but we must not let the concepts rule our minds. It is much easier to say Islam is a threat or democracy is haram than to say to another person while one is looking into the other's face, you Muslim are a threat to me, or you Democrat are a non-believing sinner. It is also people who write history. It is not only people who act, it is also people who write about these actions. We call this reporting, and if it deals with the past, history writing. When I started reading history books, I thought, oh, this is how it was. But the more I read, the more I encountered different versions of descriptions of the past. So now I know that there is no such thing as history. There are texts written by people with different views who may select different events and then give different interpretations to why things happened. Books are not only written for academia, but also, for example, to serve as school books. A recent research in Germany of 300 years of school books by Gerdien Jonker has shown that in these books describe Germany and Europe as Christian, because history was made by Christian, no matter whether the actions had anything to do with the Christian message or not. As Norman Davis says, history is, if we look at it, a construct. He says, Western civilization is a metaphysical construct, an intellectual invention created to further the interests of its inventors. Having said this, I shall turn now to the main purpose of my paper. I shall try to deconstruct the metaphysical construct called Christian Europe, because obviously what has been constructed can also be deconstructed, and then hopefully construct something new for the benefit of those who are living here together. Let me start with the first combination, Jewish-Christian. The term of the Jewish-Christian origin of Europe is used by many, but there are also others who think it is controversial. On one side, it is applied like self-explaining. On the other side, it is criticized as illegitimate appropriation. German playwright Jürgen Habermas writes under the title Leadership and Leitkultur in the New York Times, "Defining the lead culture by religion is not in the least better than doing it by German culture. With its pretentious appropriation of Judaism and an unbelievable indifference towards the fate that Jews have experienced in Germany, the proponents of lead culture use Jewish Christian tradition as a proof that we are different from the others, foreigners in Germany." Admittedly, this is a very German way of looking at the question of Jewish-European relations. However, with respect to European culture, what is it that we really can identify as Jewish root or of Jewish origin? Is it the 7-day week, which comes out of Hebrew-Jewish culture, which is indeed the basis for the organization of our everyday life? Worldwide, can we say that world culture, therefore, has a Jewish root? On the other side, it is, for example, Scott Atran who tells us that there are indeed connections during the history of our development. I quote, "Christianity, which merged Hebrew traditional belief in monotheism with Greek belief in universal laws applicable to the whole of creation, originated the inclusive concept of humanity, the idea that all cultures and civilizations fall under one transcendent set of rules." So, in the end, there may be a Jewish root to our culture. The next step is the Christianization of Europe. In the beginning, there was a geographical region which we call today Europe. Then there was a religion which was spread on it, mostly through force. Today, we call this Christianization. Alexander Ritchie describes this process with the following words: "The spread of Christianity was one of the definite moments in the creation of Europe. The advance began within the bounds of the Roman Empire during the first centuries AD. The first bishoprics were established in Northern Europe by the 4th century. The bishopric of Reims, for example, was first mentioned in 314. A process accelerated by the conversion of the legendary Frankish King Clovis. For those outside the empire, conversion was often brought about by force, and one of the most successful of these Christian warriors, the man who essentially created the Holy Roman Empire, was called Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. Short as this narrative is, it does report indeed the basic facts. However, there arise some questions. First, was this message of peace and brotherly love the right message for the wild people of the north? There are doubts. And Joseph Rovin says, for example, that this process was not without problems. I quote, "The image which the Germanic people had of themselves helps understand the difficulties which were in the way of Christianization. Enormous internal and external changes were necessary until the idea of a loving and suffering God, the idea of mercy and neighborly love, found their way into a world which was filled with the battle cries and in which only honor or shame existed. The Germanic myths and sagas characterized a people which was rooted deeply into a harsh and hostile nature." From this second, we may come to the second question. We must ask if this process actually was successful in the end, if the Christian message actually got into the heads and the action of the people. The answer seems clear to me. Considering the warfare that has taken place over a century in the name of Christianity, up to the Holocaust, the message may have entered the brains of the Europeans, but it did not make them act accordingly. Christianity may be the message of a religion of peace. The history of Europe was definitely not peaceful. There is one important event which is not mentioned by Alexander Ritchie, Constantine, and the fact that he made Christian teaching a state religion. This opened the door for Christianity as official religion, and it was the base that it could be spread all over Europe, but at the price of sacrificing one of its most important teachings, the separation of church of state. So quite early, we must face the fact that by its rulers, Europe is called Christian, but it is these very rulers who at the same time betray its core message. Following this, I mean, it's clear to say that since the religious message was brought to Europe by Christian and not by Muslims, it is obvious that Europe was not Islamized, and I don't need to go into detail at that. The only thing is it's important to understand that right from the beginning there has been not only wars between Europe and the Islamic world, but also commercial exchange, and the rulers have given each other's artifacts. So at least the ruling elite knew that there was another culture and that they connected with it peacefully. Further development of the Christian Occident. Christendom is a religion defined during the course of many councils and other events. It is a multi-layered phenomenon which has developed during the course of centuries. First, important Greek thinking. During the 13th century, the universities brought the encounter with the philosopher Aristotle. Next, so logic, also his physics, philosophy, and ethic were studied. The rediscovery happens mainly through contacts with Arabic and Jewish philosophers in Spain and the south of Italy, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. Thomas of Aquinas tried to amalgamate Christianity and Aristotle. He sees faith and reason as a unity which mutually assure themselves. Revelation and natural order cannot contradict themselves. They meet in the same truth. The mercy of faith has as its precondition the nature of the Spirit. This does not destroy nature in order to replace it, but makes it complete. The underlying question for Christianity, as well as for Islam, throughout the centuries is how to bring together revealed knowledge and researched scientific knowledge. Pope Benedict, a leading religious intellectual, claims that Christian message and Greek logos have united to create a unique message. If this is true, we might discuss later. Second, Roman order. Joseph Rovin describes the close connection between the German Empire and the Roman history, which also has a religious Christian dimension. I quote, "The imperial authority reached, in theory, across the whole globe in a way," and this theory was developed in the chancelleries of Friedrich Barbarossa and Frederick II, "that the rights of each individual, each people, and each kingdom were part of one universal order of law. The empire was holy because it originated in the will of God, as the Davidian kingdom of Charles the Great. It was Roman because it continued the Imperium Romanum, and it was German because, due to the announcement of the Pope, the German people was chosen to be the carrier of the Translatio Imperii. However, the term Holy German Empire of Germination came up only in the 15th century, when the empire was already in a state of decay." So here we have this kind of union of Christianity, of politics, and of Europe all together. There is no indication of a separation between state and religion, but at the same time, it doesn't say anything about how Christian actually the people lived in Europe. Did they follow the commands or not? It is just an intellectual religious superstructure. Federal and feudal at the same time, the empire was the exact opposite of the centralism which the House of Carpeting tried to establish in France, which chose a totally different way of building a state and having the relation between state and church. Therefore, and this is, concerns only really Germany, but still it's important, I think. Therefore, the federal structures of the Federal Republic, which is so eager to be like other nations, is a heritage which for 1,000 years was the origin of splendor and misery, but most of all made German history unique. And because this, I must say, this is still in our heads, I mean, Germans are just so fiercely federal, which I think hardly anybody in the UK can understand. I mean, and it gets a little crazy when you think we have 16 states, and education is the affair of the federal states, and we have about 16 different educational systems. I mean, that I think is taking a little bit too far, but okay, we are federal. German author and historian Goloman, who closed this chapter, echoes these thoughts when he speaks about his opinion that the Germans believed to have inherited the mission to create order from the Romans. Ha! Okay. Now I'll take you through three different fields, that is science, economics, and politics, to check, are they Christian? Are they influenced by Christianity? Were they, or are they not at all anymore? Science. Christians and Muslims seeking knowledge. The history has been told so many times that I can be short here. While in Europe the believers focused on the knowledge of the transcendental, Muslims pursued knowledge of the real world wherever they could find it. The House of Wisdom stands for many institutions in which philosophical texts from the Greek past were translated and digested. Especially the wisdom of the Greek was later on, as I already mentioned, taken up by the people of the Christian churches and integrated into the edifice of Christianity. Or, to stay with the image of the blanket, Christianity developed into an ever-expanding patchwork blanket over Europe. In natural sciences, Europe could live for centuries from the work of the Muslims. The Arabs brought the Indian numbers from India and spread their usage. Their medicinal knowledge was applied for centuries by European doctors. As we all know, the development of the Islamic world and the Christian world went then different ways and into different directions. It was like a scientific seesaw. As Europe went up, the Islamic world went down. We still don't know all the real reasons for the closing of the door of ijtihad and why science was taken up in earnest by the Christians. The believers in both religions went both ways at different times. However, also in Christianity soon incompatibilities were found between findings of science and the content of the Holy Scriptures. Church and scientists started a fight that lasted for centuries. In Europe, the Church did not open itself to sciences. In reaction to scientific progress, the Church claimed to be infallible in moral matters and thus went against all principle of openness, which we cherish so much in the work of, for example, the philosopher Popper. Today there are scientists who think that the reason for these difference in development of science may not so much be in the teaching of religions, but in the fact that intellectual concepts from Roman times were integrated into European thought patterns, but not into the Chinese and into those of the Islamic world. I quote from a German researcher, Eric Brede, who himself quotes an Englishman, Hoff. He says, Hoff calculated that in the 12th and 13th century, Europe, China, and the Islamic world had roughly the same number of scholars, but that in the East they never achieved a corporate identity. Therefore, in the Islamic world and China, scholarship never acquired the independent power that it was to achieve in Europe. One reason it did develop in the West, he says, is because of the rediscovery of Justinian's code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, towards the end of the 11th century. This reintroduced the concept of a legal system, a new science of law, which led to ideas of shared knowledge which could be discussed and argued over. So as a summary, everything I've said leads back somewhere to Rome and Greek philosophy. Christianity, certainly in science, really did not enhance scientific knowledge or stimulate anybody to do some scientific research. Let's see what happened in the field of economics then. Economics, Calvin and the religion of economics. With the Reformation initiated by Martin Luther, Christianity was not only divided forever in religious aspect. The following development brought forward, in addition to the 30 Years' War, also new thoughts which gave religion a new turn. Calvinism, which in its own right became the motor of great turnovers. Germany, for example, became the most grim Protestant country of them all. In connection with the question of economics, there is a question what it means to work. This was a development continuing to the later century, as Peter Watson writes. For one thing, the Romantic Revolution reinforced the Protestant understanding. This is the follow-up then to Calvin. The Protestant understanding of work. Instead of being regarded as an ugly necessity, it was transformed into a sacred task of man, a kind of new religion. Because only by work, an expression of the unfolding of the will, could man bring his distinctive creative personality to bear upon the dead stuff of nature. Man now moved even further from the monastic ideal of the Middle Ages, and by that of the original Christian teaching, in that his real essence was understood not as contemplation but activity. What mattered now was the individual search for his freedom, in particular the creative end which fulfills his individual purpose. With respect to economics, there also are new theories around. David Aslandis and his co-authors refer to the lack of institutionalization, e.g. the absence of legal person in their book, The Invention of Enterprise. In this book, they name 3 reasons why in traditional Islam the creation of major enterprises were prevented. First, the egalitarian inheritance law. Second, the absence of legal persons. Thirdly, the purpose orientation of foundations. So in this field, we see indeed an influence of religious thinking on the actions of the human being, which then had a direct consequences for economics. Thirdly, politics, state and church, secularization and laicite. One of the central messages of the Bible is give to God what belongs to God and give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Christians and Westerners hold this against Islam, which does not have this separation. This principle was betrayed early on when Constantine declared the Christian religion as a religion of state, as I mentioned, and the history of Christian Europe over centuries is the history of church and state fighting each other for power. After the 30 Years' War, people learned that there are no winners in war and that it was not good to fight wars in the name of religion. This was not the end of all wars, though. So we come to the separation of church and state in Europe. Usually, the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War of 1548, is seen as the beginning of separation of church and state. In my opinion, it really was Niccolò Machiavelli, with his writings, who laid the foundation of the separation of theology and politics. For Machiavelli, the end always justifies the means, and the maintenance of a state requires no justification beyond survival, because life without the state is unthinkable. A prince need only be victorious and maintain his rule, and whatever means he employs will be looked upon as honorable and will please everyone. This effectively marks the point of separation between theology and politics. So I guess Machiavelli was Christian and was a Catholic, but in his writing he clearly says, okay, there is something beyond or beneath religion. It is the state and the prince, and whatever he does is right. So already that is another step away from a Christian message and Christian practice in Europe. Today we distinguish that the Federal Republic is a secular system and not laicist like in France. But also one could say that part of the German system is indeed laicist, as Joseph Rovin says, writing about the last decades of the 18th century. From 1871 to 1876, the German Empire was in a cold war with the Vatican and the German Roman Catholic Church because Bismarck was afraid of the influence of a foreign rival power which controlled 1/3 of the population. I mean, this sounds like and reminds me, of course, of what happens in the present. Once again, there is a strange power which get its direction from foreign countries and fierce mullahs. So we've been through that before. Like all initiatives of Bismarck since 1871, this fight of a convinced conservative and a pious Protestant, who of course was in the first respect statesman, it was a war without winners or losers. At the same time, however, it was an important step towards a lay society, which he surely did not attempt to establish, because if you take away from the Catholic priest the right to register families and the control of primary schools, you also had to take it away from the Protestants for reasons of equality. So the fight of Bismarck against the Catholic Church ended up also in a fight against the Protestantism, and by this religion, the religious sphere and the political sphere in Germany was even divided farther. So if you look at science and if you look at politics and economics, you can see little traces of Christian thinking, but you also see that the development constantly from Catholicism to Protestantism to secularism moved away from it. So I come back to my original question. Europe, a Christian continent today. The formula of the Jewish Christian Occident is used very often not as a neutral description of the origins and the culture of Europe, but as a means to draw a line towards the other. If you look at the lifestyle in the different countries of Europe today, the question arises, which parts of the Christian message are still part of the reality, adhered by the people? With other words, is Europe still, at all, a Christian continent? The author Meinhard Miegel writes, looking back to and embracing thoughts from antiquity, the Europeans who till then were oriented towards the transcendental turned towards the real life in an exclusive way which no civilization had done before. The conflicts which arose with this change of perspective were extreme. For a long time it looked as if the Europeans would break apart, but in the end the Europeans solved their problems. 6 of the 7 days of the week they put to the service of Mammon. 1 day remained dedicated to the old worships. Then they moved everything religious into the private sphere. Who felt like it could from then on multiply his material wealth during the whole week, the whole year. In the meantime, the Christian set of values which determined Europeans for almost 1,000 years is for most people only a very distant memory. Most often, not even that. Life belongs undivided and uninhibited to material life. It centers around the satisfaction of material needs. Nowhere the failure of Christianity shows itself in a more brutal way. The anchor of this religion on earth, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and taught total material abstinence. In few points, the biblical reports about him are as clear as in this respect. Finally, I would like to quote Norman Davis once again, who summarizes Christianity in Europe with the following words. It is the greatest of ironies that the gospel of love, the religion of the weak, the slaves and the oppressed, became the official ideology of the Roman Empire, and thereafter the official religion of almost every European state until recent times. Power politics had little time for Christ's commandment about loving thy neighbor as thyself. And it is small comfort that Christian rulers treated other Christians, heretics and non-conformists, even worse than they treated non-Christians. I agree with this, but I would not call it irony. Summary. It was people who brought the Christian teaching to Europe. It was people who in the course of 2012 years turned their back on this teaching. The history of Europe is a history of fights between church and the state, between church and science, between church and economics. It certainly is not a history of brotherly love by accepting the message of the gospel. And it is people who still claim that Europe not only has a Christian heritage, but is Christian. As for the first assumption, This may be regarded as a matter of phrasing and discussing it. As for the second assumption, this certainly is not valid. Therefore, we, the people, should rewrite our history. The future. I have started this paper with a quote from an American poet. I shall close with the quote of an American president. When the results were announced on the night of his election victory, Barack Obama said the following: "Is this election result? It's the answer spoken by young and old, rich and poor, Democrat and Republican, black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, gay, straight, disabled or not disabled." For me, this is the best statement of inclusiveness by any politician I've heard, and I wish more people would listen to it and accept it as the model for an inclusive approach to describe a society. Finally, a little appendix about roots. It was my intention to deconstruct the myth of a Christian Europe, because I believe that Christian Europe is a construct built by generations of historians, and what has been constructed can be deconstructed. Now one may say construction and deconstruction are technical terms coming from the field of engineering. And should we not ask ourselves if man is not rooted in the history of his culture, and do these roots not limit his capability to construct and deconstruct? Let me answer with the words of a great American architect and thinker, Buckminster Fuller, who has said, "Man was born with legs, not roots." In my opinion, this should be the maxim of all people on earth. Instead, human beings worship the past, for example, to justify exclusion, to keep others out. By looking backwards, people immunize themselves against the stranger, the other. However, worshipping the past says nothing, absolute nothing, about present times in Europe. Europe may indeed have some Christian roots, but how Christian is our present? As we have seen from social scientist Meinhard Miegel, everything that exists today is a denial of Christianity, or even better, a reversal. Human beings, especially those who live in the big cities or agglomerations in the 21st century, have to remember or learn anew. An apple tree may have the roots and the stem of one kind, but the apples may be of a different kind. A rose may have a stem of one kind, but the flowers are from a very different kind. The technique through which these results are achieved is called grafting. We should be aware that over centuries, in the course, our present culture came into existence from many different elements, that there were, in the course of time, many elements integrated and still are being integrated. In this sense, no culture is pure, or, as the Catholic Christian Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was the president of the Muslim country of Senegal, said, "Toute civilisation est métissage." Each civilization is a hybrid. Thank you.